The Mitford sisters were British aristocrats who gained notoriety in the 1930s for often scandalous reasons. The six have been dubbed the Duchess, the Fascist, the Communist, the Nazi, the Novelist, and the other one. So, just how are they so controversial? And why are we still so intrigued by them? Join me to find out. The Mitford family from which the six Mitford sisters hailed can trace its origins in England back before the Norman conquest of the country in the 11th century. At the time William the Conqueror crossed over from France with his Norman knights to conquer England, the family was headed by Sir John de Mitford, who ruled Mitford Castle, Northumberland, in the north of the country on the Scottish border. Incredibly, the Mitfords retained a landed presence here for the next 800 years. The sisters' father was David Bertram Ogilvy Freeman Mitford, the second Baron Redesdale in the English peerage. He was notoriously eccentric, but the family was relatively accomplished. For instance, his great-great-grandfather had been a noted British historian in the early 19th century. Their mother was Sidney Bowles, whose father Thomas was a member of Parliament and prominent writer and publisher who founded several well-known British magazines of the time, including the original Vanity Fair. David and Sidney had 7 children in all following their marriage in 1904. The eldest, Nancy, was born just months after their wedding. Pamela was born in 1907 and was followed soon after by Thomas, their only son, in January 1909. Their third daughter was born in 1910. There was a lull before Unity was born in August 1914, just days after the outbreak of the First World War, in which David served in France. Jessica was born in 1917, followed finally by Deborah in 1920. Thomas would only live until his mid-30s, as he was killed in service in the final months of the Second World War in 1945, fighting in the Pacific Theatre. The sisters, though, would nearly all go on to live long lives. These were shaped significantly by their parents, with David being staunchly conservative, while Sarah flirted throughout the 1930s and 1940s with fascism. This would eventually lead to their separation in 1943 in the midst of the Second World War, but as you will see presently, the political controversies of the Mitford family ran even deeper. The eldest of the Mitford sisters established their reputation for intelligence and dysfunction. The girls were raised in a fairly isolated manner, being homeschooled in a chaotic way, and suffering from having 2 parents who were distant and neurotic in equal measure. As a result, Nancy turned to the extensive library at their home of Batsford House. It was there that her literary aspirations first developed. She was introduced to British high society on her 18th birthday in 1922, and thereafter emerged as a formidable figure in the interwar period, striking up friendships with esteemed writers of the time such as Evelyn Waugh and John Betjeman. This was in her role as one of the most publicly visible members of the so-called Bright Young Things, a group of young members of the British aristocracy and upper middle class who became well known in 1920s Britain as much for their parties and heavy drinking as for their artistic and literary work. Meanwhile, in 1933 she married Peter Rodd, the son of Sir Rennell Rodd, a British diplomat and politician. It was an unhappy marriage which Nancy only entered into after a long courtship with Erskine Hamish, a son of the Earl of Roslin, failed to result in marriage. Nancy was seemingly unaware that Hamish was gay, and had in fact at one time been involved in a relationship with her younger brother Tom. It was also in the 1930s that Nancy began applying herself to writing for the first time, obtaining a position as a regular columnist in The Lady, one of the magazines established by her maternal grandfather. She also published her first novel entitled Highland Fling in 1931, the first of 8 novels which she would write. By the late 1930s, though her marriage was failing, and though they wouldn't divorce until 1957, she and Rod essentially lived apart from the late 1930s onwards. During the Second World War, Nancy became involved with a French officer who had headed for England following the fall of France to the Nazis in the summer of 1940, Gaston Pawlowski. They began a passionate affair, and it is clear that he was the love of her life. After the war ended in 1945, They settled together in France, and it was here that she entered into the second notable stage of her literary career. This was as a historian, and in the 1950s, she worked on and published well-regarded biographical studies of 18th century figures, such as King Louis XIV of France, Frederick the Great of Prussia, Madame Pompadour, and the French Enlightenment philosopher Voltaire. Sadly, her relationship with Pulewski did not survive these years, and she also became increasingly ill from cancer in the 1960s. She eventually died in Paris in 1973. In many ways, Pamela lived the least noteworthy life of the six Mitford sisters, though as we will see, some of her siblings garnered attention for all the wrong reasons. She was a private woman who liked a simple country life, and as a result she was known as the Quiet Mitford and the Forgotten Sister. Nevertheless, her marriage in 1936 to Derek Jackson, a wealthy and esteemed atomic physicist, garnered public attention, not least because Jackson was a notorious bisexual who eventually married 6 times and engaged in a string of affairs. He was also rabidly anti-Semitic. They bonded over a love of horse riding, but eventually divorced in 1951. Thereafter, Pamela became a close companion of an Italian horsewoman by the name of Giuditta Tomasini. It is widely suspected that theirs was a sexual relationship, and Pamela was bisexual herself. However, they split in the early 1970s, following which Pamela lived a quiet life in the Cotswolds and London. In 1994, Pamela fell down steep stairs and broke 2 bones in her leg. Despite an operation, she wouldn't recover and died in hospital on the 12th of April 1994, aged 86. The middle Mitford sisters, Diana and Unity, were undoubtedly the most controversial. They took after their mother, whose politics were scandalous, and who during the Second World War refused to renounce her support for fascism. This was a trait which was shared by the only Mitford boy, Tom, who in the late 1920s had become affiliated with Nazism on a visit to Berlin, and who was sent to fight against either the Italians or Japanese during the Second World War, as he refused to take up arms against the Germans. In Diana's case, her dalliance with fascism was extremely public. Though she had married Brian Walter Guinness, heir to the barony of Moyne in 1929 when she was just 19 years of age, this first marriage soon began to collapse after Diana met Oswald Mosley, who was 14 years her senior. Mosley hailed from the minor British aristocracy and had been a promising figure within British politics in the 1920s, serving as Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster in Ramsay MacDonald's Labour government between 1929 and 1931. However, thereafter he became disillusioned with mainstream British politics, and as much of Europe was flirting with more extreme political ideologies in the aftermath of the Wall Street crash and the onset of the Great Depression, Mosley founded the British Union of Fascists in 1932. It was around this time that he and Diana met at a garden party. Both were married, but Diana soon left her first husband, and Mosley's wife died in 1933. Thereafter, their courtship developed steadily. They were married in 1936 at the home of the German Minister for Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, in Berlin. It's noteworthy to point out that the ceremony was attended by Adolf Hitler. Though the British Union of Fascists garnered some support in Britain during the 1930s, once the war commenced with Germany in September 1939, this evaporated. In 1940, as Germany began its invasion and occupation of Western Europe, followed by the Blitz of Britain, Oswald and Diana were incarcerated by the government. They remained there until 1943, by which time the war had turned against Germany, and figures like the Mosleys were no longer deemed a major threat to British domestic security. In the aftermath of the conflict, she and Oswald were unable to live in Britain and relocated to France. There, Diana developed a considerable literary career in the aftermath of the war, editing The European, a magazine with pro-fascist leanings, and for a time became a review writer with the New Statesman. She remained unrepentant about her fascist past down to her death in Paris in 2003 at the age of 93. Diana's support for fascism was shared by her younger sister. Unity was born in 1914 and came of age in early 1930s as the political landscape of Europe was becoming increasingly polarized. She shared a room with her sister Jessica, who was her ideological opposite. At one stage in their teenage years, they drew a chalk line down the centre of the room, with Unity decorating her half with a Nazi swastika and a portrait of Adolf Hitler, and Jessica hanging a communist hammer and sickle and a picture of Vladimir Lenin. As she entered her early adult years, Unity was sucked into the world of British and German fascism by her sister Diana's relationship with Oswald Mosley. In 1933, when she was just 19, the sisters attended the Nazi Party rally at the city of Nuremberg, the first of the major spectacles here after the Nazi Party had seized power in Germany. Unity returned to Germany the following year to study at a language school in Munich, but her true purpose seems to have been to meet Hitler in person, a feat which she accomplished some months later. It is clear that she was attempting to woo the Nazi dictator, who was 25 years older than her, and throughout 1935 and 1936, she attempted to further ingratiate herself with him. These efforts were ultimately in vain, as Hitler's relationship with Eva Braun became more serious in the mid-1930s, but Unity nevertheless became a part of the inner circle of the Nazi leadership. By 1936, her virulent anti-Semitism, which eclipsed that of other members of her family like Diana and Tom, was clear, and she was being monitored by MI5 on account of her activities in Germany. When war broke out in September 1939, Hitler advised Unity and her sister Diana that they would need to return home to Britain. Unity was distraught and attempted to take her own life by shooting herself in the head. Hitler paid her medical bills and she made a partial recovery. Unity ultimately did return to England early in 1940, although her injuries had resulted in some brain damage from which she never fully recovered. There, the most intriguing aspect of her story occurred, as she is believed to have entered a maternity hospital and potentially have given birth shortly afterwards to a child who was given out for adoption. The records concerning this are very hazy, and this in turn has allowed speculation to grow over the decades that Unity had given birth to a child of Hitler's who was living somewhere in Britain throughout the second half of the 20th century, probably unaware of his own parentage. However, there is no concrete evidence to support this supposition, and if Unity did give birth to a child during the war, it was most likely fathered by John Andrews, an RAF pilot with whom she had a brief relationship at this time. Unity's health deteriorated in the course of the 1940s, owing to ongoing complications caused by her attempted suicide in 1939. She died in 1948, aged 33, from meningitis caused by cerebral swelling around the bullet in her head. While Diana and Unity are openly associated with the British and German fascists in the 1930s and 1940s, their younger sister Jessica embraced ideologically polar opposite political views. She reacted intensely against her conservative and aristocratic upbringing and reviled her parents' politics. In rebellion, at 19 she married her second cousin, Esmond Romilly, who had just returned from a stint of serving with the communists in the Spanish Civil War. They spent some time in the late 1930s in North America, constantly short of money despite their backgrounds. When the Second World War broke out, he joined the Canadian Air Force, but was killed in action in November 1941, when his plane disappeared on the return leg of a bombing mission over Nazi Germany. The second chapter of Jessica's life opened in 1943, when she married an American civil rights lawyer by the name of Robert Trollhuff. They moved to California, where she became an American citizen the following year. There they both joined the American Communist Party, activities which saw them pulled in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee in the mid-1950s, at the height of Senator Joseph McCarthy's Red Scare. However, it was really in the 1960s that Jessica's fame started to grow as she became one of America's most noted investigative journalists, exposing the dark underside of everything from the funeral business in America to providing early exposés of the American prison system. She wrote many books, including an autobiography entitled Ons and Rebels, which anatomized her family's peculiar politics and background. Amongst other things, Jessica Mitford has been lauded by figures like Christopher Hitchens and J.K. Rowling for her courageous political beliefs in journalism. She eventually died of lung cancer in 1996 at the age of 78. The youngest of the Mitford sisters, Deborah, lived a notable life herself, but again one which perhaps pales in comparison with the exploits, good and bad, of some of her older siblings. In 1941, at the height of the Second World War, she married Lord Andrew Cavendish, the son of the 10th Duke of Devonshire, one of the oldest and richest noble lines in the British aristocracy, and the Lords of Chatsworth House, one of England's finest noble estates in the middle of the Peak District. Deborah's primary claim to fame was somewhat less controversial than some of her siblings. She became the public face of Chatsworth House and oversaw the development of it into one of England's finest stately homes, replete with its own gardens and tourist amenities, while she also patronised the redevelopment of several small villages on the periphery of the vast Chatsworth estate. She authored several books on Chatsworth, its history and current state, and also drove the refurbishment of the vast house itself. As a result, Chatsworth House is one of the most acclaimed tourist sites in northern England today. Politically, she leaned more towards Jessica, and in the 1980s, she'd become a member of the left-leaning though short-lived Social Democratic Party. When Deborah died in 2014 at the age of 94, the story of the Mitford sisters, with all its contradictions and interesting twists and turns, came to an end 110 years after the birth of Nancy back in 1904. Thank you everyone so much for watching this video on the Mitford sisters. I hope you found it interesting. Each of the sisters probably could have had their own video, so if you want videos more in depth, please do let me know, and if you have any other suggestions, also let me know down in the comments. I hope you guys are subscribed and notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them, and anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.